So, this week we are looking at Silvia Moreno-Garcia's novel, Mexican Gothic. Right, so I'll try to keep this spoiler free. I cannot promise, but I will, if I can't avoid spoilers, I will signpost things. And also, I've got notes over here on my computer, so if you see me sort of glancing over this way occasionally, it's just to refresh myself. I have read the novel, well, I listened to it as an audiobook twice. Um, I enjoyed it. Maybe it's because it was hyped up for so long, and it was a few years after it came out, before I was able to read it. It came out in June of 2020, and there was no reason that I didn't read it at the time, other than that I just had a lot going on. I was reading other things, watching other stuff, um, doing, still working, obviously working from home. It was a weird time. Um, but it was just it was just one of those books that you keep thinking, oh, I've got to read that. I've got to read that. And finally I got around to it. The first time in December 2025, and then more recently in April 2026. And honestly, the second time I listened to it, at little over, I think at 1.2 speed rather than at just sort of the official speed, and that helped. Nothing against the performance. I thought it needed to kind of clip along a little bit better, and I think that was my way of making that happen, was just to speed it up. In fairness, though, I do tend to do that, not with all audiobooks, but there are those that I will do this with, and it just, I don't know, I just makes it go a little faster, literally, but I think just psychologically, I want it to go faster, um, even even when I'm enjoying them. So the basics of this story, for those of you who haven't read it, and if you have read it, I would love to hear your opinions of the book. Feel free to place that in the comments, and let me know, what you think of Mexican Gothic. When you read it, how often you've read it, if it's more than once, and what your thoughts were. Now, this book was really, really hyped up for a long time when it first came out. It was a big, big deal, and also great cover art. By the way, I really, shouldn't judge a book by its cover, but I did love the cover of it, and I don't know. I think I built this book up in my head quite a lot, and when it came to it, I enjoyed it. I really liked the main character, Noemi Taboada. I thought she was a really um, realistic character. Really, she was a likable character, but she was not a nice person. Although I think that served her. I think she needed that edge in order to survive what she experiences when she journeys to visit her cousin at, High Place in up in the mountains in Mexico, and in on the edge, but not within, a almost a not it's not a ghost village or a ghost town. There is still a population in the town, but it is much reduced, and the silver mine that was once a huge source of money and all in the area, and of labor, employment in the area, that has stopped production for a long, long time. And so it is a much diminished place. And yeah, she just, sorry, that was a sidetrack. But yeah, so Noemi she is a character that I was able to get on board with. I really liked her. Um, but and she of course does grow a great deal across the story. She starts out as kind of she's good-hearted, but she's got a shallow streak. She's got a little bit of mean streak, really. She can be a bit using of people, not in a horrible way, just, she doesn't seem to value people. And I think it's because she doesn't know what she wants. And that certainly is something that's made very clear right from the beginning, that this is a young, privileged woman who leads a very safe, very affluent life in Mexico City. She comes from a very wealthy family. She has money. And she is a very intelligent person. She's a very talented person. But she doesn't know what she wants. She knows that she doesn't want the life her mother wants for her, which is to just find a husband and get married and have children. She at least doesn't want it yet. She's not saying never. She's just like, right now, she wants to go to school. She wants to do a master's degree. She wants to do something different. But she keeps changing, does she want to study this? Does she want to study that? And what does she want? And she doesn't know. And she goes out on the social scene a lot, but you get the impression that people like her because she's wealthy and beautiful and sophisticated, but they don't like her as a person. And she seems to feel like people talk about her a lot behind her back, and they're only nice to her because of who she is and because she's in their, she's there and part of their social scene. But she grows up basically thanks to what she experiences during the novel, and by the end is a much more well-rounded person, someone who is able to express their feelings, to embrace their feelings, to embrace the idea of decision making and permanency and commitment, in all kinds of ways. And I don't just mean in a romantic sense, that is part of it, but in terms of who she is and what she wants in her life. So when we first encounter Noemi, she has, and this is right at the very beginning of the novel, so this is giving nothing away really. She's out at a party, at a fancy dress party. She, is mixing with, the young elite of Mexico City. And she's there with her escort, so someone she's flirted with and all that, but she's not in love with him. She doesn't even seem to really like him very much, to be honest. He's just there. And she gets a summons from her father to come home right away. And she does, she doesn't seem to be too bothered about leaving the party, for one thing. But she also, seems to feel like she has to do as her father asks her. And she hurries home, and he hands her a letter that he has just received from her cousin Catalina. Now, we find out that Catalina is more than just a cousin, that she's like an older sister to Noemi. She has grown up with Noemi because Catalina's parents died when she was young, so she's raised by her uncle, Noemi's father, and his wife, Noemi's mother. And she has, in the last few months, she is married a man who lives well outside of Mexico City, who is a member of an English family living in the mountains and who had been silver mining magnates in the past, before the revolution, the Mexican Revolution. And she has, Catalina has fallen wildly in love with him, married him very quickly. Her uncle was not real happy about this. The rest of the family, we get a sense that they were a bit concerned, but there was no stopping her. She absolutely was head over heels for this man, Virgil Doyle. And shortly after their marriage, he whisks her off to his home, far away, in a remote village that was once a mining village, as I say, before the Mexican Revolution. So decades before. And this is, by the way, this is set around about 1950, that this all takes place. And they're concerned because the letter is full of the letter from Catalina is full of, sort of wild things are, that she's saying, things in the walls, the house is haunted, everything here is strange, I feel like everything's out to get me. And they're genuinely concerned. I mean, they both read the letter and are like, this doesn't sound like Catalina. This sounds like there's, she's not well. Either she's sick with a physical illness, or she's got something going on with her mental health. Either way, they feel the need to get in touch with her, to go and see her. And they haven't heard from her really at all since she's been married, not nearly as often as they would have expected. As that someone like her would have been in touch with her family. And they just kind of, chalk it up. Noemi in particular just sort of chalks it up to, she's a newlywed, she's enjoying being a newlywed, she's happy, and she just hasn't got around to writing, But this letter is their first clue that maybe there's more to Catalina's situation than that. And her father says to her, you're going to go to El Triunfo, the village where Catalina is living, or the house, the Doyle's house is just outside of it. And you're going to see for yourself firsthand what's going on with your cousin, because this is concerning. And although Noemi's she loves her cousin, she wants to make sure her cousin's all right. She's a little bit concerned because this is going to be interrupting her studies and things. And her father says, look, do this, and when you come back, you can catch up with your studies. Even if you have to do an extra semester, it will make it work. And to sweeten the pot, he says, you can do a master's degree. I'll pay for it. I'll take care of it. You will be allowed to do a master's degree at the university. Just okay. So she has to leave right away because there are very few trains that actually go to the village near where Catalina lives now. So she very quickly gets herself packed, gets on the train, goes, and I guess they send a telegram to say, I'm on my way to come and see my cousin. I'll be there on this train at this time. And she is picked up, when she gets there, she is picked up by her cousin's husband's cousin, Francis Doyle. Francis is fluent in both Spanish and English, and he begins, speaking Spanish to Noemi, but does say to her, my family doesn't really speak Spanish. I do, but the rest of them, the house is really only in English. And she's fine with that because she's had a very good education. She is absolutely fluent and comfortable in English. And so they switch to English at this point. Obviously, this is just described to us. The book is not in Spanish to this point. But anyway, she, heads up to High Place, and it is at this point, and this is where I have to really be careful because now we're getting into more of the nitty-gritty of the book. She meets the Doyle household. She discovers there a very strange, not very welcoming family with a very old, decrepit patriarch, Howard Doyle, who is very much the head of the family and who is very, very old, very, very unwell. He's in bed most of the time, though on her first night he does make a point of coming down to greet her, and get to know her a little bit. She's not particularly, she's not impressed by him. He's got some very outlandish and problematic views, to say the least, particularly on the subject of eugenics. He's pro it. And eugenics, if you don't know, eugenics is, it claimed it was a science. It was, of course, not. It's very much a pseudoscience that is basically about a sort of racial theory, and is all geared toward proving the supremacy of the Caucasian or white race. Um, and they did all sorts of things. They would measure and literally have charts of things like skin color, eye color, hair color. They would measure, like, the circumference of your head. Use things to look at the bumps and all on your head, your brow ridge, the height of your forehead, the shape of your eyes, nose, mouth, height of your cheekbones, your chin, all of this stuff. And it was to determine how superior or inferior you were as a person. Supposedly your intelligence could be determined by things like the volume of your brain. It's ridiculous stuff. It's absolutely ridiculous stuff. But that's what it was about. And Howard Doyle's a believer in it. Now, Noemi, she is actually a little bit familiar with it, particularly thanks to her interest in anthropology. She is familiar with some of the ideas. She absolutely dismisses it. But she is familiar with the thinking and the theories behind it. And again, remember, this is 1950. So the discrediting of eugenics on the whole has only really, it's mostly there, but it's not completely done. It is, and yes, if you're wondering, it is behind a lot of the sort of racial theories behind, groups like the Nazis, white supremacist and fascist movements in countries like the US and the UK. And in fact, a lot of eugenics studies were done in places like the US and the UK. It's, really nasty, gross stuff. And as I say, a pseudoscience, because we now know, amongst other things, that race is a social construct. There is no genetic basis for it. It is a purely arbitrary one. Skin color is not race. Okay, skin color is skin color. I digress. But anyway, although it is actually one of the important themes of the novel, this idea of race, because one of the things that is sort of pretty much instantly commented on, not immediately, but in the course of the conversation that Noemi has with Howard Doyle, he notes that she is darker skinned than Catalina, and he has all these sorts of theories about, and things he's read elsewhere, about how a certain degree of mixing between different races can in fact strengthen the bloodline. And so he's not concerned. He's not worried about the fact that his grandson Virgil has married a Mexican woman. He's fine with that. It might strengthen their line. But he still has some really twisted views. And this idea of race, as I say, it is an important one in the novel. But, amongst other things, the family is very small, very strange. Within a few days of her being there, she starts to pick up on the idea that there has been some kind of terrible thing that has happened in the past with this family, that they were once very well off, but they are now on not hard times, but their circumstances are much reduced. The house, High Place, it's a kind of perfect Gothic mansion, because it's this huge house. Apparently, she's always talking about these winding corridors and these long corridors where she's, getting lost sometimes, or whatever during the night in particular. It's a very run down place, though. She notices a lot of places where the walls look a bit damp, where there is literally mold growing on the walls. At one point, she goes into the library of the house and discovers that some of the books have mildew and mold on them, or in some cases starting to sort of fall apart a bit because of all of the damp and the damage that they have endured, you know, in these conditions, which are really just not good for books. Um, and it's also a very dark place. You know, she very quickly is told that yes, the house has electricity, but the wiring is old, it's quite weak. So they try to reserve the electricity for sort of certain things, and that means for stuff like lighting and so forth, they just use candles, oil lamps. And, you know, Noemi doesn't, she's never used, I mean, she knows how to use candles. She says, you know, I don't have the slightest idea how to use an oil lamp. I've never used one, you know, and so she kind of has to learn to do that. There's no radio, there's no gramophones, there's no anything. It's a very quiet house. And she's told by Francis's mother, Florence, that the house has to stay quiet. That this is because of Howard Doyle, that he is, you know, he is very ill, he is very old, he needs it quiet. Sound travels in the house. So, you know, they don't even talk during dinner, you know, and she's a very, very social person who enjoys conversation. And, you know, this family is, you know, just so weird, so closed off, so quiet, so limited in so many ways. And they don't really, apart from Francis, they don't really seem to go much of anywhere. And she, of course, immediately is wanting to see her cousin, Catalina, and is told Catalina's too ill. She manages to, nonetheless, get permission to visit with Catalina very briefly, and she finds her cousin very quiet, very altered. She's not real sure what's going on with her. She's told that Catalina has tuberculosis, but she's like, well, I don't know, but my understanding is that tuberculosis would not do what, you know, what Catalina is going through. And is told, well, particularly once the family's doctor arrives for his weekly visit, you know, and he's a very patronizing, you know, irritating person who just wants to dismiss her and is very put out by the fact that she questions him at all. And, you know, she's just, this is not right. Something is wrong here. I don't know what it is, but something is wrong here. Something is wrong with my cousin, and it's not what they're saying. There's something is wrong with this house, with this family. I don't like it. And she's, you know, she's stuck there for a certain amount of time. As I say, the trains don't come very often. So she's limited on when she'll be able to leave. She's obviously wanting to stay and sort of spend some time with her cousin. She misses her cousin, but she is also very concerned about her cousin. And so she's got to figure out, you know, what's going on. And now this is where it gets really, really tricky to avoid the spoilers. But it involves mushrooms. And I'm not kidding. If you have read the book, you know exactly what I'm talking about. If you haven't, I'm sure you're going, pardon? But yeah, fungus, mushrooms, these play a huge role. In fact, kind of in my head, Howard Doyle, the patriarch of the family, he's, you know, to me, he is the mushroom king. And mushrooms play a much greater role in the horror of this story than you might expect. Not enough if you like mushrooms as I do to put you off eating them. It's nothing like that, but it is disturbing. And it has to do with all kinds of things, to include ancient pagan worship, mind control, body horror to a small degree. Yeah, it's it's a weird story. But yeah, so but it is, as to, you know, sort of the credentials of the book. I mean, it's called Mexican Gothic. Gothic, it absolutely is. As I say, the house called High Place, you know, it's, as I say, it's moldy, it's putrid, it's damp. It's diseased. It is this huge house. It once was obviously a very grand, prosperous place, but it is no longer. Um, all of that kind of stuff. And in particular, you know, the sort of the monstrousness of the monstrous old man, the dying, decrepit. And as Noemi begins to realize when she gets a little too close to him, um, he seems to be rotting. You know, he has sores and all sorts of things going on with him. So he is very monstrous. And his son, Virgil, his son, Virgil, called him his grandson earlier, and that's wrong. It's his son, who is married to Catalina. He is this cruel, lecherous, um, horrible person. And the woman who is running the household, Frances, she is, or sorry, Florence. Francis is her son. Howard is her uncle. She is a cruel, self-hating woman. And she only cares about her position within the family and, you know, sort of how she gets along with Howard. Um, the only member of the Doyle family who turns out to actually be a decent person is Frances. And fairly quickly in the story, Noemi and Frances become friends, and they develop quite a good friendship, quite a close friendship. And he is able to tell her all kinds of different things about the family, the house, mushrooms. Um, and he is very much a kind of victim. He is kind, he is naive, and he is more or less rescued by Noemi, as is Catalina. Although Catalina does do some of the rescuing, Francis does do some participation and help with the rescuing, not least because he knows more about the house and about what's going on with the Doyle family and High Place than Noemi or Catalina possibly could, because, of course, he was born there. It's his family. He's grown up there, so he knows a great deal more. So, you know, it is a Gothic narrative in a Gothic setting, 100%. The Mexican side of it, now I'm not going to pretend to be an expert on Mexican history. I've never been to Mexico. I know bits about Mexico. I did do some reading, particularly because the Mexican Revolution gets mentioned relatively frequently. And Silvia Moreno-Garcia, the author, does mention in an afterword that in part this story was inspired by some of the mining towns, ghost towns, where mining was once, central to these towns' lives and activity, but that fall out of use during the time of the Mexican Revolution in the early 20th century. And as far as the British presence in Mexico, the British never colonized Mexico. There were other colonies in South America and Central America that were British colonies, but not Mexico. But beginning in the 1820s, you see a number of people who come from Cornwall to Mexico, and they settle in the mountains of Mexico and engage in silver mining. And Mexico's not the only place that sees an influx of miners from Cornwall in England, but it is certainly one of the places. And in fact, these Cornish miners are, in fact, amongst other things, credited with bringing a fondness for a love of soccer, football, to Mexico, as well as Cornish mining techniques and a few other little aspects of Cornish culture, to include the idea of the Cornish pasties, kind of like a savory turnover type dish, um, like a handheld pie type thing. Um, so the Doyle's presence, being there for a very long time, engaging in silver mining, and essentially being an English family in Mexico, there is scope for that. But at the same time, when we're at High Place, and that's where most of the novel takes place, is at High Place, everybody speaks English. Um, Everything is very much English culture, and ways and traditions and norms. Um, Most of the family doesn't even speak Spanish, which is bizarre because you have to imagine most of them would have been born there. And yet they don't, in Mexico, I mean, but they don't speak the language. They don't mix with the population. They've imported essentially their own servants, their doctor, they don't mix. And they really look down upon the locals in their area, and indeed, by and large, they look down upon Mexicans. Um, and even the sort of climate around High Place, it's constantly described as very cool, very chilly, damp, rainy, and they have these rainy seasons. It sounds much more like England, quite frankly, than it does Mexico. And apart from, she makes a couple of trips into El Triunfo, the village nearby. She, Noemi, that is, she is, of course, herself Mexican. Um, and we meet her in Mexico City, but she leaves Mexico City very quickly. And although she reminisces, sort of thinks sometimes, and we obviously are privy to these thoughts of, holidays in Mexico, in various parts of Mexico, her life in Mexico City and places nearby. But apart from these sort of vague references to the silver mining, which, Mexico's not the only place for that, and to the Mexican Revolution, I don't know what makes this particularly Mexican. Yes, technically it is set in Mexico, but that setting doesn't feel very present. And it almost felt more like a selling point, a sort of hook, a twist. This isn't just Gothic, this is Mexican Gothic. And it doesn't really delve into any kinds of folklore, history, traditions, superstitions. A little bit of the history, but not much. She has written, Silvia Moreno-Garcia has written other novels where we do get much more sort of that Mexican setting, but not Mexican Gothic, I have to say, despite the name. So this was not the first of Silvia Moreno-Garcia's novels that I had read. Her first one that I had read was actually The Bewitching. And I enjoyed that one, I have to say, a lot more. And it honestly, it felt like it should be more the one that highlights its Mexican credentials. It involves much more sort of Mexican folkloric traditions, superstitions, and so forth, in a way that, ironically, Mexican Gothic just doesn't. And, it was, again, I enjoyed it. I liked the characters. I thought it was an interesting story. I'll never think of mushrooms and fungus and mold in quite the same way. But as I say, what helped for me, because I thought the middle kind of dragged a bit. The ending I liked. It was a little crazy, but I liked it. And what helped me ultimately, as I say, was listening to it at 1.2 speed, rather than at the normal speed. And I think if I had been reading it in a book, I would have skimmed places, because it did, to me, need to pick up its pace a bit. And, I did it electronically. So yeah, I mean, I still say read the book. I think you would, I think most people would enjoy this book. It was a big hit when it first came out, but yeah, and I enjoyed it. I really did. And as I say, listening to it twice, I enjoyed it more the second time. But in terms of, sort of how I would rate it, honestly, 3 out of 5. 3.5 on a good day, but really 3 out of 5. I've, as I say, I've read another of her books, The Bewitching, and I liked it a lot better. But that's me. That's me. What did you think of it? Have you read it? I would love to hear your thoughts. I hope you've enjoyed this review. It's not the most overwhelmingly positive one I've ever done or will ever do, but, I didn't hate it. Let's put it that way. I did not hate it. I enjoyed it. I just wish it had made more of its setting, and, or at least maybe with a different title, it would have led to different expectations that would have been better met. Let's put it that way. But maybe I'm wrong. Maybe because I don't know a huge amount about Mexican history, maybe I missed something, I don't know. So let me know what you think. Be sure to say in the comments. Do be sure, of course, as usual, as always, to like this video, to share this video with anyone you think might enjoy it. Subscribe to my channel. It really helps me out, help me keep doing this sort of thing. And I will see you next week for a new episode.